Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this Sunday's edition of Alaska Weather on the 16th day of August 2020. I'm Dave Percy, a meteorologist with the National Weather Service, hosting today's show. Up first, we've got these values here, rainfall amounts for the last 48 hours. Pretty heavy, rather heavy over the Panhandle over the last couple of days. Shelter Cove picking up about 5 inches of precipitation, while Ketchikan, 48-hour amount, 2.82 inches. And Petersburg, farther to the north there, had 2.5 inches, while Hyder, off to the east of Ketchikan, west of Stewart, had 2.12 inches. So really wet weekend there over the southeast coast, especially over the southern areas. Otherwise, fire danger-wise, we've got high to very high fire danger, Madanuska, Susitna Valley areas down in toward Anchorage, and an area there along the west side of the Alaska Range in the Kuskokwim Valley, southward to the northeast Bristol Bay area, King Salmon, Igigik areas, and then that area still southwest of Tanana, high to very high fire danger. And in the Copper River Basin, right along the lower valleys there, we've got high to very high fire danger as well. And southwest Kodiak Island, same thing, high to very high fire danger. And interesting to note that Sitkinak this afternoon hit 81 degrees today, while at the Kodiak State Airport had 75 there. So that kind of supports the higher fire danger in that area. And as a result of the heavy rains over the southern southeast coast the last couple of days, is a flood advisory for Ward Lake, which is north of Ketchikan a little ways there. There's also a road, Ward Lake Road or something like that over there. But anyway, that's near Ketchikan, and that's valid through noon Monday tomorrow. And mostly due to the heavy rain of the last couple of days. Could get another inch of rain through Monday over there, but it'll be lighter generally than what you've seen this weekend. The lake levels will slowly recede through Monday morning. And as you can see from the photo there's been some minor flooding of, looks like campgrounds and trails, things like that, possibly roadways as well. From there, look, there are no other watches, warnings, or advisories around the state other than the flood advisory there for Ward Lake near Ketchikan. Satellite imagery showing a stream of moisture continuing to flow from south to north right into the southeast coast today. Rain all the way up to Juneau, Sitka had some rain as well. And back to the west over mainland Alaska, clear skies and warm temperatures today. Still some variable clouds over the eastern interior there, as you can see. Real isolated showers occurring over the eastern Alaska range, and most of that in Canada, and then on down into the southeast coast. Looks like a few clouds there over the, well, actually, no, that's not clouds. Over the, not over Cook Inlet, clouds are to the south there, that low center southeast of Kodiak Island, well to the southwest of the southeast coast. Out over the Bering Sea is a lot of clouds, solid clouds, Aleutians as well. One band, a weakening front pushing moisture into the Pribilofs down toward the eastern Aleutians. Also some gusty winds with that. St. George Island had gusts to about 35 miles an hour, and then back with the main low center west of Adak, they had wind gusts also to 35 miles an hour, but rainfall with that, not really impressive. Both St. Paul and Adak picking up 1/10 of an inch, while Unalaska got about 0.04 in the last 12 hours. Otherwise, Bristol Bay sunshine, Alaska Peninsula looking pretty sunny, as well as the Seward Peninsula. And again, much of the interior all the way up across the Brooks Range. And on the chart, there's that front weakening as it pushes eastward. Wind really not a factor at all, too much. Small craft advisory level winds with that, as I mentioned, gusts to 25 to 35 miles an hour. Light rain, fog, and drizzle along in advance of the front, fog behind the front, and then more light precipitation there with that trough over the western Aleutians. Lighter winds today over south central Alaska. Still pretty gusty, 21 mile an hour wind gusts at Kenai, and they rose to 77 this afternoon, but Willow And let's see, what's the other location? Willow and Big Lake, 81 degrees this afternoon, along with Sitkinak. And the Thunderbird Falls parking lot there on the Glen Highway all had 81 degrees this afternoon, with 70s over a wide portion of interior Alaska into the Copper River Basin, and the rain over the southern southeast coast. For tonight, front weakens, continues light rain and fog into the Alaska Peninsula, low clouds and fog over the west coast and Bering Sea, fair over the interior. Rain continues over the Panhandle, lighter in the north. And for tomorrow, again, southerly flow, southwest flow keeps it wet over the Panhandle, but rainfall amounts should be lighter than they have been. And chance of showers, Kenai Peninsula, northeast Bristol Bay, fair and warm in the interior again. And that weak front stalling out right over Falls Pass continues unsettled conditions there into Tuesday. And low pressure, southern Gulf of Alaska continues to spin surges of moisture northward, working in unison with that 1,020 millibar high south of the Queen Charlottes. That's just funneling moisture from north to south right into the Panhandle. So periods of rain and fog continue through Tuesday, and cooler, cloudier temperatures now over southern Alaska, with showers extending northward almost all the way up to Eagle over the upper Tanana Valley. Periods of rain possible for the Copper River Basin, rain and showers for the south central Alaska area with possible thunderstorms along the Alaska Range. Lows tonight in the 40s to lower 50s, 30s on the Arctic coast. Highs tomorrow back into the 70s again, but cooler. 65 to 70 Kenai Peninsula, mid-70s to Sitna Valley, and 60s for the Panhandle, mid-70s central interior, all the way down toward the lower Kuskokwim and Yukon River Valley areas, 50s farther to the west. Lows in the 40s for Tuesday morning, followed by highs 64 to 72, call it, for the Susitna Valley, Copper River Basin. In the 60s, southern Alaska, lower to mid-70s in the interior.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather for Monday morning. A lot of IFR out over the Bering Sea. Some marginal VFR, though, over the, from Unmak Island up into southwest of the Pueblos, but mostly IFR out there. IFR extends into Bristol Bay with marginal VFR along the southwest coast up to the Bering Strait. VFR over much interior Alaska. IFR, eastern North Slope, eastern and central Arctic coast. And IFR across the Gulf of Alaska, southern Gulf of Alaska, in across much of the Panhandle, except the extreme north, up toward the passes, marginal VFR. And moving on to the afternoon, east side of Kodiak Island, still marginal VFR, IFR up to the eastern North Gulf Coast, IFR over the southern Panhandle, and marginal VFR to the north, with marginal VFR across eastern Copper River Basin, across the Wrangell Mountains to the southern slopes of the eastern Alaska Range. A little bit of an increase there. Otherwise, the interior stays VFR, with lower conditions right along the southwest coast. IFR, Nunivak Island, just about all of the Bering Sea and the Aleutians, with the exception of Unalaska Island, looks marginal. South side of the Alaska Peninsula to about Sand Point, maybe Chignik IFR, and improved conditions, good VFR for much of the North Slope and at least the western Arctic coast. Marginal VFR just along the central and eastern coastline. And that holds through Tuesday morning there, staying pretty good. VFR, North Slope, a good portion of the Arctic coast, southward into the interior, all the way into northern Bristol Bay. Conditions deteriorating, as you can see, for Cook Inlet, south central Alaska. Marginal VFR there with IFR on the increase. Prince William Sound, south side of the Kenai Peninsula from the Barren Islands, North Gulf Coast over to give or take Yakutat, maybe Elfin Cove. Marginal VFR over the northern Panhandle. You see some VFR over the inside waters. And still a lot of IFR, Bering Sea, and the Atka area to the Alaska Peninsula, northward through the Bering Strait. And for the Tuesday afternoon outlook, IFR, central eastern Bering Sea, but VFR for Bristol Bay. Western Alaska Peninsula in the IFR zone. That extends westward to Atka, marginal VFR, Adak to Shimianatu. And marginal VFR, Cook Inlet into the Matanuska Susitna Valley, eastward across the Talkeetnas. Coast Range, maybe southern Copper River Basin, but northward there across the Wrangell Mountains on the eastern Copper River Basin to maybe Nabezna. And IFR western Prince William Sound down across the southern Kenai Peninsula. That includes Kachemak Bay and the Barren Islands, marginal for Kodiak and IFR along the southeast coast. Passes for tomorrow, good VFR, all of them. Brooks Range, VFR, Anatuvik and Adigan, and Lake Clark and Merrill, good VFR, maybe ceilings visibilities unlimited on both entrances. Rainy, same forecast, good VFR, and windy as well, VFR Isabel. Mentasta, possible marginal VFR, southern entrance, otherwise VFR. Tanita, VFR. Portage, VFR. Chilkoot and White, occasionally marginal. And freezing levels 10,000 feet all the way up to about Point Lay. 12,000 feet, Alaska Peninsula, Eastern Aleutians. 8 to 10,000 feet, Eastern Interior, and the Panhandle. Icing, really nothing too heavy expected icing-wise. Light to very isolated, moderate icing there for the Eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. East of the Pribilofs, another batch there on the eastern North Gulf Coast of Yakutat. And yet the third one over the southeastern Panhandle area. And again, just threat, really nothing too serious expected icing-wise for the day Monday. And for the jet stream, southerly winds about 65 knots. You can see approaching the northwest coast of the Cape Lisburne Point Hope area there, coming up and over around the ridge, coming southward through the east central interior across Madanuska Valley and Kenai Peninsula, northerly 70 knots, and then coming back around from the south into with the strongest winds over the southern panhandle, about 75 knots, westerly 65 knots, south side of that Bering Sea low. 9,000 foot winds, 35 to 40 knot southerlies cutting across the southern and eastern panhandle. Otherwise, much lighter southerlies over the eastern Bering and through the Bering Strait with not too bad westerlies. And even lighter winds at 3,000 feet, pretty variable over the interior with high pressure. As far as turbulence goes, a couple of zones, light to very isolated moderate chop, especially for smaller aircraft, Alaska Peninsula, and in and around the Adak area. After the break, I'll be back with the marine forecasts.
Some places on the surface, you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places, you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICET-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Another look at the sea ice analysis finished Sunday afternoon today. Again, not much change from the last couple of days and not much change expected. Little ice movement expected over the next 4 or 5 days with continued slow melting. So moving on to the coastal water forecast there for the Panhandle on the outer coast, central and south coast. South winds 15 knots tomorrow, 4 to 5 foot seas. And south winds on the north coast turn east on the extreme north coast, but only at 10 knots with 4 foot seas. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, northern inside channels, southeast at 20. Stevens Passage, southeast 15. Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. For Tuesday, for the inside waters, pretty light winds at 10 knots from the south or southeast, and seas no more than 2 feet. At the south coast, south winds 20 knots, 5 foot seas. Southeast winds 20 knots on the north coast with 5 to 6 foot seas. And Prince William Sound, variable to east winds at 10 tomorrow, and variable winds at 10 knots for the North Gulf Coast with 2 to 3 foot seas. And the Barren Islands, south winds 10 knots, 2 foot seas, and south winds 10 knots for Kamishak Bay. Southern Cook Inlet, southwest 15, southerly winds at 10, northern Cook Inlet. And for Tuesday, for Cook Inlet, east winds at 10 knots, east winds 15 knots for the Kamishak Bay area. Barren Islands and western North Gulf Coast, a little breezier over toward Middleton Island where they'll be out of the east at 20 knots. Prince William Sound, east winds 15 knots, seas still pretty good at 2 feet. Kodiak Island tomorrow in Shelikof Strait, southeast winds 10 knots, 2 to 3 foot seas. About the same forecast for Bristol Bay with winds out of the southeast at 10. And the Alaska Peninsula looking at southeast breeze 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 4 foot seas. For Tuesday, east winds for the Alaska Peninsula. East at 15 to 20 knots, strongest Pacific side of the peninsula with 4 to 6 foot seas. Bristol Bay, east winds at 15 knots, and east-northeast winds for Kodiak Island, 10 to 15 knots, 2 to 4 foot seas. For the Fox Islands tomorrow, we've got south to southwest winds, 10 to 20 knots, with seas running 3 to 6 feet. Adak and Atka, southwest 20, seas up to 9 feet, highest on the south side of the islands. And farther to the west, westerlies, 20 knots from Shimianatu to Kiska and Amchitka with 8 to 10 foot seas. And for Shimia to Kiska on Tuesday, north 15, Amchitka Island northwest at 20, Adak and Atka west-northwest 15 to 20 knots, and east winds at 10 knots for the eastern Aleutians with 3 to 8 foot seas. For the southwest coast, southeast winds 15 knots, 3 to 4 foot seas. Southeast 15 also for St. Lawrence Island. Norton Sound looking at east winds at 15 knots with 3 foot seas. And east winds 15 for the St. Matthew Island area in the northern Bering Sea. And the Pribilofs southeast at 10 with 4 foot seas. And for Tuesday, for St. Matthew Island, pick the winds up out of the northeast to about 20 knots, east 15 for the Pribilofs and the Kuskokwim Delta Coast. Yukon Delta Coast, lighter, east at 10, northeast 15, St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, light north winds at 10 knots with 2 foot seas. For the Arctic coast tomorrow, east winds 20 knots, pretty uniform wind-wise up there, as well as sea heights 4 to maybe 5 feet, and then 10-knot winds from Cape Beaufort all the way down to Wales from the south and southeast. Outlook for Tuesday. Small craft advisories there for Kaktovik demarcation point on the far eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Otherwise, the central and east coast looking at east to southeast winds at 20 knots with 4 foot seas. Western Arctic coast north at 15. That extends down to Cape Thompson. Then from Cape Thompson to Wales, there'll be about 20 knots out of the north with seas at 4 feet. And for tonight again, fair over the interior. Maybe an increase in the clouds possibly for Kodiak Island with that high setting up just to your east. Might start shoving some low stuff in. And that could be true also for the North Gulf Coast, southern Kenai Peninsula. Flood advisory for Ward Lake there north of Ketchikan through noon tomorrow due to another possible inch of rain. But lake level slowly receding tonight and into tomorrow. Weakening front keeps wet conditions over the eastern Aleutians, but slips on into the western Alaska Peninsula and unsettled over the Aleutians. Highs in the 60s to mid to upper 70s again over interior Alaska. Low clouds and fog eastern Arctic coast, and that's on the increase over the Gulf of Alaska. And Monday, now it's highs back into the 60s and 70s. But not quite reaching the 80s with the Susitna Valley. Increasing chance of showers, western Alaska range. Periods of rain increasing for the North Gulf Coast. Light rain stays wet over the Panhandle. And cooler and cloudy over southern Alaska for Tuesday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.